The great illusion of the human journey is the belief that spiritual awakening is a finish line. We spend decades walking with bleeding feet in search of a sunlit summit, a magical moment where the fog of the mind will finally dissipate and the universe will deliver all the answers to us on a scroll of absolute certainties. We blindly believe that peace is a fixed destination, a prize granted only to the pure, the tireless, those who have purged all their weaknesses and definitively conquered their own shadows. But if you close your eyes for a moment and listen with extreme attention to the silence of your own chest, you will perceive the silent exhaustion that this incessant search provokes. We live running on an endless wheel of self-improvement, fearing our own humanity as if it were a factory defect. And it was precisely while walking through the darkest, most rustic and unexplored landscapes of the human soul that Carl Jung discovered a secret that very few dare to whisper. Awakening is not the arrival. Awakening is merely the doorknob turning on a door you've spent your whole life trying to force open with the strength of your intellect. What awaits beyond that door is a state of being that ancient mystics and alchemists called Sophia, the divine and earthly wisdom that demands no perfection. Jung, with his profound and welcoming gaze upon our imperfections and abysses, realized that true transmutation doesn't occur when you find a blinding light, but when you finally stop searching for it. Not out of frustration, not out of cynicism, and not because you've been defeated by life's harshness, but because something very ancient and wise within you has simply decided to rest. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped trying to fix yourself at all costs? Sophia isn't about being enlightened in the superficial sense that the modern world preaches. It's not about floating on a cloud of positivity above human suffering, and it's definitely not about becoming spiritually or morally superior to anyone else. It is the silent and revolutionary stage where you abandon the exhausting war of trying to become something great and begin to inhabit the sacred simplicity of who you already are. It is the exact moment when your inner and outer lives lay down their weapons and stop fighting. You realize that you no longer need to prove your worth to the gods, to society, or to that implacable and tyrannical judge who lives in your own mind. Jung wouldn't see this as a spiritual gold medal or a certificate of unattainable holiness. He would say that this is purely and simply the maturity of the soul. It means that you have dived so deeply into your own waters, faced your monsters at the bottom of the cave so often that without realizing it, the journey has ceased to be a desperate escape and has become a true encounter with yourself. However, this crossing does not announce its arrival with trumpets or grand celestial spectacles. The signs that you have crossed this invisible boundary are extremely subtle, almost imperceptible to untrained eyes and minds addicted to noise. But once you recognize them, they irreversibly change your entire perception of reality. The first and most profound of these signs radically challenges everything we have been taught about the healing process. We have been conditioned to believe that healing means erasing, that true spiritual health requires the complete elimination of pain, as if the past could be wiped clean with a white cloth, leaving a virgin and untouched canvas. But darkness is not a mistake of creation. Jung tirelessly taught us that the shadow is the dark, dense and immensely fertile soil from which our most authentic truth springs. Therefore, the first sign that you have entered the mystery of Sophia is not the magical disappearance of your wounds. They remain there, exactly where they have always been, drawn into the fabric of your destiny, engraved in your flesh, in your history, and in your memory. You remember with crystal clarity everything that happened. Do you remember the unexpected blow, the betrayal, the crushing grief, the fall into the abyss? Do you perfectly remember that fragmented, immature, and fragile version of yourself that lacked the emotional tools to weather the storm when it broke over your life? The whole story remains alive within you. But the great alchemy happened in the silence of your being. Looking back now, your soul doesn't contract. Your body doesn't recoil in fear or revulsion. There is no longer that spasm of uncontrollable agony, nor a violent emotional reflex forcibly dragging you to the bottom of the well of the past. The story exists. It's real, but it no longer demands to be relived with every beat of your heart. The pain hasn't disappeared, but it has completely changed roles. What was once a cruel master who secretly controlled all your reactions and invisibly dictated your limits now sits very quietly at the back of the hall of your consciousness. It has ceased to be the distorted lens through which you judge yourself and assess the dangers of the world. Imagine a majestic, ancient tree in the middle of an untouched forest, struck by a devastating lightning bolt during a terrible storm. The deep mark of fire and destruction remains etched into its bark for decades. The tree cannot undo the storm. The tree cannot erase the severe burn from the lightning strike. But as the seasons pass and the cycle of life continues, it continues to grow, expanding its branches towards the sun and deepening its roots into the earth around that charred wound. The mark of the lightning becomes part of its fundamental structure, an element of its unique and tragic beauty, and no longer a constant threat to its survival. This is precisely what Jung described as the sacred integration of the shadow. It is not the tense and desperate act of repairing something that is permanently broken, nor the childish fantasy of living a completely scar-free existence. It is the moment of pure and devastating honesty in which you recognize that the parts of yourself you so hated, hid, and resisted were never unforgivable mistakes or character flaws. They were vital responses. They were born as thick, heavy shields when you desperately needed to survive, and they remained with you, painful and limiting, until you had enough strength, presence, and compassion to understand the fundamental message they carried. At this sacred point in the journey, the noise of inner conflict finally silences. You no longer waste your precious life energy arguing with yourself in the dead of night, crafting imaginary defenses, trying to prove to the universe that you are already healed, that you are good enough, or that you have the right to occupy a space in the world. The old voices of condemnation lose their urgency and commanding power over your nervous system. You didn't need to muzzle them with false positive affirmations or empty mantras. You simply sat with them in the dark and listened long enough to understand what they were ultimately trying to protect you from. The wound then breathes compassionately, but no longer bleeds. It transforms into a sacred scar, an inner altar, a silent witness to something profound and undeniable. You survived yourself and the world outside. The heavy lead of suffering has been masterfully transmuted into the gold of wisdom. You no longer need to fight against what has already passed, for pain has found its rightful place in the vastness of your biography, ceasing to be a paralyzing obstacle and becoming the very foundation of your path. However, when the war against the past ends and the weapons are finally laid down, a new and disconcerting landscape unfolds on the horizon of your mind. What happens to your life when you no longer need to be the heroic wounded person seeking healing? What remains of you when the main objective of your existence ceases to be overcoming trauma and seeking light? How do you breathe when the spiritual identity you have built with so much effort over the years begins to silently crumble like smoke in the morning wind? It is precisely in this dizzying void where the old character dies and the new one does not yet have a name to present itself, that the next great mystery of our being resides. An unknown space where the subtlest illusions of the mind are severely tested, and where true freedom demands that you have the courage to abandon not only your shadows, but also your own resplendent mask of light. When the dust of the inner battle finally settles and you realize you no longer need to fight your past, a very strange silence takes over your life. It is at this exact point in the journey that the vast majority of travelers get lost, for they encounter a terrifying void. For years, your compass was pain and your destination was healing. You consumed sacred books, participated in rituals, repeated affirmations, and built with immense effort a shining fortress around yourself. The identity of the spiritual person, the tireless seeker, the constantly evolving human being. You learned to use the correct vocabulary, to demonstrate calculated compassion, and to display the trophies of your overcoming. But Carl Gustav Jung, with his relentless vision of the traps of the human mind, left us with a dark and fascinating warning. He taught us that the ego is a master of disguise, and that its favorite fantasy, the most dangerous of all, is to dress itself in clothes of light. The spiritual ego is the last and most refined barrier before true freedom, because it doesn't look like a prison, it looks like a temple. However, the second major sign that you are crossing Sophia's threshold is precisely the silent and inevitable fall of that sacred mask. There is no dramatic event that triggers it. There is no thunder in the sky or an overwhelming crisis of faith. There is only a very subtle, almost ghostly shift in what previously seemed to be of utmost importance. The identity of being awakened begins to loosen its grip around your throat. The labels of enlightened, conscious, or healed completely lose their luster and begin to sound strangely hollow, like words repeated so many times that they lose their meaning. You don't reject spirituality, but you realize that these definitions no longer describe your real experience. They add nothing, and most surprisingly, they no longer require defending. Imagine yourself sitting in an ordinary coffee shop on any given afternoon, sharing a table with an acquaintance. This person begins to talk incessantly about their own spiritual achievements, about how high their energies are, about the complex practices they perform at dawn, and how they can see the ignorance of the rest of the world. In the past, this scene would have been an instant trigger for you. Your old self would have immediately kicked in. You would feel an urgent need to agree, to share your own mystical experiences, to subtly prove that you too are on this elevated path, or perhaps to judge the other person's hidden arrogance. You would do a quick mental scan, a kind of internal ranking system, measuring who is more evolved, who has more wisdom, who is closer to the truth. But now a silent mystery unfolds within you. You simply listen. You drink your coffee. You observe the movement of people on the street through the glass window. You look at the person in front of you and feel no impulse to compete, to correct, or to guide them. There is no impatience. There is no desire to intervene. You realize, with a clear compassion devoid of arrogance, that the other person's spiritual pride is merely a heavy armor they still need to wear to feel safe in the world. You once wore that same armor, so you allow them to speak, without trying to steal the spotlight. You understand viscerally that human growth has its own clock, that consciousness unfolds at the exact pace the soul can bear, and that forcing someone's evolution is not an act of love, but an act of control disguised as kindness. When you stop trying to be the teacher of the universe, the need for recognition vanishes like smoke. If someone considers you a genius, you don't become vain. If they consider you a fool, you aren't offended. Your sense of worth has stopped begging for applause. It's an almost frightening lightness. You've dropped the mantle of the savior and discovered that you don't need to be special to have the right to exist. And when that artificial identity crumbles, all the mental energy you spent sustaining it is freed. Where does this immense force go? This is where the narrative takes an unexpected turn. For centuries, you have been taught that the path to the divine is an upward journey, a desperate attempt to transcend matter, to escape the heavy flesh and flee to the pure world of ideas and spirit. But the profound wisdom revealed by Jung, echoing the oldest principles of alchemy, shows that true transformation requires precisely the opposite movement. Light must descend and penetrate the darkness of matter. The third sign that you have found your center is that wisdom abandons the labyrinth of your thoughts and descends into the dense temple of your physical body. Your body becomes your absolute compass, your most faithful oracle. The mind lies all the time, the body never. You begin to notice this in the most everyday situations. Imagine you're about to sign an employment contract, or you're saying yes to a social invitation, or agreeing to begin a relationship. Everything on paper seems perfect. Logic approves. The people around you applaud your choice. But then, suddenly, you feel an inexplicable tightness in the pit of your stomach. A subtle yet constant tension takes hold of your shoulders. Your breathing becomes short and shallow. In the past, you would have violently ignored these signs. You would have told yourself it was just fear of the new, that you needed to be rational, that you were missing a great opportunity, and you would have forced your will against your own flesh in the name of progress. Now, you recoil. You have learned to respect the silent intelligence of your cells. You understand that this physical contraction is not a problem to be solved with meditation or therapy. It is precise information. It is life saying no through you. Similarly, when something is true and aligned with your destiny, there is no uncontrolled euphoria or mental fireworks. There is only deep relaxation. Your chest opens effortlessly. A feeling of good weight, of grounding, takes hold of your feet, as if you were finally stepping onto solid ground after days adrift at sea. You no longer need to look for answers in the heavens because you have learned to read the silent language of your own sensations. You stopped trying to tame your body as if it were a wild and imperfect animal, and accepted it as the sacred chalice where your soul dwells. This radical acceptance of your own incarnate humanity brings an unshakable peace in the face of life's fluctuations. You no longer despair when you wake up sad or without energy, because you know that the low tide is not a defect of the ocean. It is merely a phase of its natural rhythm. However, this new and profound intimacy with your own skin provokes a mysterious side effect. When you no longer need to perform for the world and find such comfort within yourself, your relationship with your surroundings changes drastically. The walls of your house take on a new contour. The empty space around you gains weight and texture. But what happens to the human soul when it no longer has absolutely anyone to reflect its image? What happens in moments when there is no work to do, no messages to answer, and silence fills every corner of the room? The next mystery descends upon the human experience like a heavy cloak, forcing you to confront the force most feared by modern humanity, revealing that what you always tried to avoid was, in fact, the only place where your true power lay dormant. When the doors to the outside world close and the echoes of others' approval fall silent, the human soul often falls into a deep panic. We have been taught, through centuries of conditioning, to fear emptiness more than death itself. The absolute silence of a solitary room is the most deafening sound the ego can hear. For there, without distractions, without applause, and without scripts, all masks begin to melt under the heat of one's own consciousness. Carl Jung, the wise old man who mapped the abysses of our spirit, saw voluntary isolation not as a tragic punishment, but as the essential alchemical laboratory for human transformation. He knew that the gold of wisdom is not forged in the public square, nor under the lights of social vanity, but in the solitary furnace of one's own presence. For a long time, you have fled from this furnace with all your might. You filled every millimeter of your time with noise, endless tasks, self-imposed obligations, bright screens and empty conversations, creating an impenetrable wall of distractions just to avoid having to sit face to face with yourself. Loneliness, before, had a bitter taste of exile and the cold smell of abandonment. It was an agonizing waiting room where you waited, with a racing heart, for life to begin again outside, for someone to knock on your door, for an external sign to confirm that you still existed on the world map. The gaze of another was your oxygen and your only mirror. Without someone to reflect your image and validate your actions, you felt you were evaporating, losing your outline, disappearing into the thick air of an afternoon without commitments. But the fourth great mystery of Sophia's journey is revealed precisely when solitude loses its sharp teeth and ceases to be a predatory threat to her identity. The silent alchemy finally takes place within her chest. The isolation, which once crushed her ribs with the force of a dark ocean, suddenly transforms into a vast, illuminated, and perfectly breathable meadow. You don't retreat to your corner out of bitterness, cynicism, or disappointment with humanity. You simply discover the serene ecstasy of no longer being fragmented. Being alone ceases to be a state of profound need and becomes a state of absolute fulfillment. The silence of the empty house asks absolutely nothing of you. It doesn't demand that you smile, that you adapt, that you translate your feelings into understandable words, so as not to disturb the expectations of others. What happens to your perception of reality when you discover that the most fascinating, welcoming, and healing company you could have in this entire universe has always been waiting, in complete silence, inside your own skin? It is in this precise moment of silent revelation that true existential self-sufficiency, so revered in mystical and theosophical teachings, blossoms in your heart like a lotus on troubled waters. You stop once and for all, using relationships as anchors to stabilize your fragile identity in the face of life's tidal waves. You no longer seek romantic connections or desperate friendships just to escape your own well of anguish. Consequently, the magnetic quality of your presence in the world changes drastically and unmistakably. When you finally choose to be close to someone, to open your home or your heart, this choice is born from a place that is already completely satiated and not from a stomach rumbling for affection and validation. You discover that you can enjoy deep and genuine intimacy without the constant fear of losing your own center of gravity. You can love without the unhealthy need to possess or control the other person's every move, and you can distance yourself when necessary without that distance triggering the old alarms of anxiety and abandonment. Jung always warned us that we ruthlessly project our gods and demons onto the people we claim to love, turning them into prisoners of our own unconscious needs. By integrating your own being into luminous solitude, you free the other person from the terrible and unjust burden of having to make you happy. Relationships cease to be contracts of mutual emotional survival and become free, sacred, and spontaneous encounters between two whole souls. You realize with crystal clarity that you no longer need to be seen by anyone to feel real. Your sense of wholeness has established its own roots, thick and deep, which drink daily from subterranean sources invisible to the common eye. Solitude thus becomes the most stable and secure ground you have ever trod in your entire existence. It is a sanctuary to which you return not to lick your wounds in secret, but to celebrate the almost scandalous simplicity of existing without having to perform a character. However, this profound solitary peace does not mean the end of your journey in the hectic world of forms. The mystery deepens vertiginously when you inevitably need to get up from your armchair, open the front door, and return to acting in the complex and noisy web of human society. How do you move, create, work, and interact in a world that glorifies exhaustion and demands relentless effort when your soul has completely lost its old, devouring hunger to prove its worth in the eyes of the crowd? Here we enter Sophia's fifth major sign, a fascinating and almost invisible turning point in the narrative of her inner biography. Throughout almost her entire life, the driving force behind her actions, ambitions, and movements was the painful feeling of lack. Her will, sharp as a steel blade, was often used to forcibly cut through life's natural resistance. You tried to shape destiny with your own hands, pushing open locked doors with your shoulders, exhausting your physical and mental health to manifest results that could validate your passage through this world. Even when you accumulated evident successes, awards, or material comfort, the tension remained rooted in your bones because your actions did not stem from cosmic harmony, but from a constant and paralyzing fear of scarcity. You acted frantically because you blindly believed that if you stopped rowing against the tide for even a single second, the boat of your life would sink into the abyss of failure and oblivion. Your willpower operated as a weapon of declared war against the chronic uncertainty of tomorrow. Jungian thought accurately observes that the inflated ego attempts to impose its minuscule and limited order upon the majestic and intelligent chaos of the unconscious and the universe, resulting only in incurable spiritual fatigue. But in this new and profound stage of existential maturity, this desperate hunger for conquest simply falls asleep. Your will does not disappear, does not become weak or lethargic. It undergoes an unprecedented alchemical purification, transforming brute force into subtle direction. Daily action ceases to be a bloody struggle in the trenches of routine and becomes a fluid, authentic, and undeniable expression of your purest essence. You continue to make choices and build your reality, but you only do what you feel is the right move at the exact moment, delivering your vital energy to where it naturally wants to flow, just as water descends the mountain, skirting the stones, without asking which is the most glorious path. Success and failure lose the dramatic, definitive, and terrifying tone they once possessed. If an undertaking doesn't flourish, you don't take it as a personal offense from the heavens or as proof of your inability. You don't double down, dominated by pride or blind panic. You simply pause reverently, listen to the subtle change in the direction of the winds, adjust the sails, and release the ropes of that which no longer has life. What if true and absolute human power doesn't reside in the aggressive ability to force the world to obey one's petty desires, but rather in the unwavering wisdom to know exactly when it's the perfect time to let go of control and stop rowing? This is the age-old secret that the ancient masters described as action through non-action, the movement that flows from the perfect alignment between the conscious axis of the ego and the vast, immeasurable wisdom of the higher self. You are no longer a dead, defenseless leaf passively dragged along by the winds of circumstance, nor are you the exhausted and lonely tyrant trying to divert the storm's direction with your own chest. You become the very dance between the wind and the leaf. The feverish urgency with clenched fists is replaced by an almost indescribable precision. You act on the world stage, solve practical problems, pay your bills, and take care of your loved ones. But there is a disconcerting and luminous lightness behind every movement you make. The crushing weight of needing things to happen in a strictly specific way dissolves into thin air, like mist in the morning sun. Failure loses its power to destroy identity and is received merely as another piece of essential information, a silent and neutral guide that redirects your feet in the darkness. Your will ceases to impose arrogant demands on reality. It learns the noble art of listening first. This new way of moving through the fabric of the world brings with it a relief of immeasurable proportions, because you finally understand, in every fiber of your being, that life was never an enemy to be slain with a sword, but an infinite mystery to be revered and experienced. You stopped swimming with tense muscles against the force of the current and discovered that the river always knew, from its deep source, the exact and safe path to reach the ocean. However, acting with such grace, detachment, and without needing the contractual promises and guarantees of success causes an inevitable short circuit in one of the oldest, most solid, and tyrannical beliefs of the human mind. When you genuinely stop fighting against the reality of things and fully embrace the natural unfolding of the present moment, an invisible, gigantic, and oppressive structure begins to silently crumble around you. Persistent ghost that has haunted all generations of human history, that has always robbed us of peace of mind and kept us prisoners of fear and anxiety for uninterrupted millennia, begins to definitively lose its authority over your soul. As your purified will surrenders to the sacred flow of existence itself, the hands of the clock of your life begin to melt and lose their meaning, irresistibly announcing your approach to a new, liberating, and mysterious portal of wisdom. When the crushing weight of forcing reality finally crumbles and your will aligns with the sacred flow of existence, the most rigid pillar of human illusion begins to melt before your eyes. The sixth great mystery of Sophia's path reveals the end of a silent tyranny that has governed our species since the dawn of civilization, the relentless dictatorship of time. Throughout your life, you have been a loyal prisoner of an invisible clock. The ego, in its eternal fragility, is an entity that cannot survive in the present moment. It desperately needs the past to justify its pain and, with even greater urgency, the future to project its salvation. Consider the terrifying amount of vital energy you have spent over the years, believing in the dangerous promise that peace was a geographical or temporal destination. You secretly told yourself that you would be happy when you finally solved that financial problem, when you found the ideal partner, when you healed your childhood trauma, or when the world outside finally recognized your worth. Your entire life has been transformed into a gigantic and exhausting waiting room. You sacrificed the beauty of the present on the altar of a tomorrow that never arrived, because as soon as the future became the present, your anxious mind immediately created a new, unattainable goal to continue justifying your own dissatisfaction. But Carl Gustav Jung understood that the human unconscious, like eternity itself, completely ignores the passage of linear time. Deep in your soul, everything is happening now. And when you enter this new stage of psychological maturity, the spell of time simply breaks, not dramatically, but through a clear and liberating perception. The past loses its frightening density. It is no longer a court where you are judged every day, nor a ghost that you need to exorcise repeatedly in exhaustive therapies. What happened remains part of your history, but it no longer argues with your present moment. The past has found its rightful resting place in the libraries of your memory. Simultaneously, the future loses its false authority as savior. The unbearable pressure of knowing how everything will end dissolves into thin air. You stop postponing your own existence. You discover, with a mixture of shock and profound relief, that peace is not a reward given at the end of a marathon of suffering, but the very substance of the present moment. Imagine a traveler who has spent decades obsessed only with the map and the final destination, ignoring the breathtaking landscapes along the way. One day, out of sheer exhaustion, he lifts his eyes from the paper and looks out the train window. The movement itself becomes enough. Life ceases to be a problem to be solved tomorrow and becomes a mystery to be lived today. And it is precisely when you anchor yourself absolutely in this eternal now that an even deeper revolution occurs in the way you see other human beings. By ceasing to flee to the future, you can finally look into the eyes of the person in front of you without any distortion. This inevitably leads us to the seventh great sign, one of the most painful and misunderstood rites of passage in human evolution, the death of the savior archetype. From a very young age, many of us have been conditioned to believe that to love means to rescue. We have been taught that true compassion requires us to carry the pain of the world on our shoulders, to offer ready-made answers to the suffering of others, and to throw ourselves in front of the abyss before our loved ones fall. There is a curious and disturbing fact in depth psychology that few people dare to confront. The compulsion to save others is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, an ingenious maneuver of the ego itself to avoid dealing with its own impotence. We try to fix our friends, partners, and family members because their pain awakens unbearable anguish within ourselves. Our help often carries a selfish urgency. We want the other person to get better quickly, just so we can feel comfortable again. Jung had a formidable and incisive insight into this phenomenon. He believed that the greatest form of spiritual disrespect one human being can commit against another is to presume to know, with absolute certainty, what that person's soul needs to evolve. What you judge to be a tragedy or a terrible mistake in someone's life may, in fact, be the exact alchemical furnace that person's unconscious created to forge its own wisdom. There is a classic account in biology that perfectly illustrates this spiritual law. A man found a butterfly cocoon and, seeing the insect desperately struggling to break through the silk and emerge, decided to help it. With small scissors, he cut the cocoon and freed the butterfly. However, the insect emerged with a swollen body and withered wings, and never managed to fly. The man did not know that the excruciating struggle to pass through the narrow hole of the cocoon was the exact and necessary mechanism created by nature to pump fluid from the butterfly's body to its wings. In trying to spare the insect from suffering, the man, driven by blind and ignorant compassion, destroyed its ability to fly forever. At this advanced stage of your awakening, this biological and spiritual truth takes root in your cells. Your compassion radically changes in form, color, and weight. You continue to love deeply, continue to feel empathy, and continue to perceive the world's pain with an even sharper clarity than before. But you no longer absorb it as a personal rescue mission. You abandon the hidden arrogance of wanting to fix what is not yours. When someone you love enters a dark night of the soul, you no longer run with a flashlight trying to drag them out of the cave. Instead, you sit at the entrance of the cave in absolute silence, maintaining the sacred space for the other to make their own crossing. Your help ceases to be verbal, invasive, and controlling, becoming purely vibrational. You offer presence instead of advice. You offer stability instead of shared despair. And then, an incredibly surprising and almost magical phenomenon begins to happen around you. By ceasing to try to fix people, you stop invalidating the innate intelligence of their destiny. When you stop treating others as fragile victims in need of saving, they suddenly begin to access their own reserves of strength and wisdom. The people around you begin to feel mysteriously calm and safe in your presence, not because you have all the brilliant answers to their problems, but precisely because you are not trying to steer them anywhere. Your lack of judgment and your refusal to interfere create a field of coherence so powerful that it serves as a clean mirror where the other can finally see their own truth. True love, you discover, is not a rope pulling the other out of the hole. It is the silent light of the lighthouse that remains unwavering while the other learns to navigate their own storm. But by letting go of the reins of time and abandoning the heavy armor of the world's savior, what remains of human life? When the mind loses its fixation on the extraordinary future and the heart gives up being the tragic hero of someone else's story, the curtain rises on the eighth and final mystery, the most silent, the most invisible, and, paradoxically, the most frightening of all signs for the ego accustomed to grandeur. When the heavy armor of the savior archetype crumbles, and the hypnotic illusion of the future loses its power of attraction, an absolute and terrifying silence descends upon the soul. It is at this precise point of mutation that the human ego, accustomed to feeding on grand epic dramas and promises of spiritual glory, suffers its last and most devastating shock. Throughout our existence, we have been conditioned by countless traditions and philosophies to believe that the pinnacle of human development would be crowned by a spectacular event. We expected the heavens to open, a blinding light to sweep away our shadows forever, and for us to be swept into a state of mystical trance and permanent ecstasy. But the eighth and final mystery of Sophia's path is so devoid of spectacle, so naked and so silent, that the overwhelming majority of travelers pass through it blindfolded, refusing to accept that the final answer could be so simple. The great and frightening twist of the journey is not the discovery of a magical and superior world, but the shocking revelation that life suddenly becomes wonderfully ordinary. The voracious appetite for peak experiences, for transcendental revelations, and for altered states of consciousness simply starves. You no longer seek the isolated mountain to find the divine, because the artificial separation between the sacred and the profane crumbles completely before your eyes. Carl Gustav Jung observed that the great tragedy and the root of the neurosis of the modern soul lie precisely in this violent division between spirit and matter. We have been taught to despise the everyday world as if it were an inferior prison, believing that true purity could only be found in escaping physical reality. But in this new stage of profound integration, the invisible wall that divided these two worlds dissolves. The miracle is no longer hidden in a complex ritual or a distant temple. It descends and infiltrates the most common textures of your daily life. You find yourself standing before the sink, feeling the temperature of the water running through your hands as you wash a simple dish, and suddenly the entire universe is there. The act of washing dishes ceases to be an irritating obstacle that distances you from important things and begins to carry the same depth as a silent prayer. You walk down a noisy street without needing the walk to lead you to a grand destination, and the simple articulated movement of your legs is perceived as a phenomenon of indescribable intelligence. No dramatic magic occurs in these moments. Life doesn't gain a celestial soundtrack. What changes irreversibly is that, for the first time, you've stopped ignoring the raw miracle of existence. This is where a formidable point of tension arises, a final crisis where the mind attempts to rebel against this overwhelming simplicity. The intellect, addicted to complexity and the narrative of heroism, cries out in despair that enlightenment cannot be just that. The mind demands a certificate of genius, a public acknowledgement that you have surpassed the sleeping masses. But as you settle into this ordinary stillness, you realize that something gigantic has disappeared from your mind, the invisible audience. Throughout your life, even in your most intimate moments of solitude, you were narrating your growth to a phantom jury. You secretly measured your level of consciousness, assessed how healed you seemed in the eyes of others, and performed your own evolution. Your entire life was treated as an illuminated stage where you needed to prove you were the protagonist of a story of overcoming. Now, the theater is completely empty. The stage has been dismantled. The unhealthy need to be seen, to be validated as a profound soul and understood in all its complexity, loosens its suffocating grip around your neck. You are no longer living an epic story to tell others. You are simply being lived by life itself. And contrary to what fear whispered, you don't feel smaller, invisible, or disposable because of this absence of applause. You feel dangerously free. The sacred no longer needs to announce its arrival with golden trumpets. It requires no epic effort of concentration. It is present in the gentle way you breathe without trying to control the airflow, in the way you watch the rain fall without categorizing the weather as good or bad, and in the peaceful realization that absolutely nothing needs to be added to this exact millisecond for it to be perfect. This is by no means the glorious end of the journey your vanity expected. It is, in fact, the exact moment when you stop abandoning your own life in the hope of finding it in an enlightened future. Nothing extraordinary is happening around you, and the mind finally yields to the realization that this is exactly enough. Sophia, the ancestral wisdom that guided the steps of the great alchemists, is not a medal of honor, a celestial geography, or a reward for good spiritual behavior. It is simply the crystalline clarity that emerges from the ashes when you, exhausted from so many useless battles, decide to stop running away from yourself. Nothing in you has become superhuman. You didn't defeat your demons in a heroic battle. You simply realized they were fragmented and frightened parts of your own psyche, desperately seeking integration. You stopped fighting your own imperfect nature. You gave up the violent and endless task of trying to correct yourself to fit the mold of an idealized person who never existed. And in that monumental pause, the dust settled, and something very ancient could finally be seen. Not a superior and immaculate version of yourself, but simply what has always been there, waiting with oceanic patience, hidden beneath mountains of effort, frantic searches, and the agonizing need to become someone important. If these words echo strangely familiarly deep within you, understand that this does not place you on a pedestal. Recognizing this truth does not mean you have won the human race. It only means that the natural wisdom of your being, which has never been absent, has finally found a crack in your armor of tension and has been able to breathe. When the thick layers of spiritual egoism crumble, the clarity that emerges is not blinding. It is cold, sober, and profoundly grounding. Therefore, the final question that concludes this long and tortuous journey is not whether you have finally reached the state of Sophia. To ask that question is to prove that your mind is still trapped in the old snare of measuring, comparing, and seeking results. The only question that truly remains standing, echoing in the absolute silence that remains when all your illusions have fallen to the ground, is infinitely more challenging. Are you truly willing to look at yourself exactly as you are in this split second, without the dramatic stories you've told yourself for decades, without the protective roles you've learned to play to survive, and without the relentless pursuit of what comes next? Just this naked moment, just you breathing here, and for the first time in the history of your existence, have the overwhelming courage to admit that this is all you've ever sought. We have finally reached the ultimate threshold of this journey, not before a golden portal that will transport us to a magical dimension free from suffering, but before the most naked and honest mirror that our soul has ever dared to face. Throughout our lives, we have been conditioned to believe that redemption would come in the form of a great cosmic rescue, a resounding epiphany that would erase our flaws and elevate us above the human condition. But what to do the next day? When the sun rises, silence fills the room, and you realize that you still inhabit the same skin, carry the same name, and walk the same streets. It is precisely here, in the undeniable freshness of the present moment, that the true alchemical work begins in practice. The path to applying Sophia's mysteries does not require you to abandon your life, flee to the mountains, or adopt Spartan disciplines of purification. The real practice, the most courageous and transformative of all, is the radical acceptance of your own humanity in real time. Carl Jung taught us that the individuation process was never about achieving moral perfection. Perfection is a sterile and controlling fantasy of the ego, a shiny armor we wear to hide our fear of rejection. Wholeness, on the other hand, is the courageous embrace we give to all our fragmented parts, welcoming the mud and the lotus with the same reverence. To bring this ancient wisdom into the rough texture of your daily life, you need to change how you react to discomfort. Tomorrow morning, when an old anxiety tightens your chest, or when someone says something that triggers your deepest anger, don't immediately try to take a deep breath to pretend you're an unshakable being of light. Don't repeat empty affirmations to numb the pain. Instead of trying to transcend the moment, descend into it. Feel the texture of the anger, the weight of the fear, the temperature of the sadness. Observe these emotions not as enemies proving your spiritual failure, but as orphans of your own psyche, frightened fragments knocking on the door of your consciousness, asking only to be seen without judgment. When you stop fighting what you feel, the emotion loses its haunting character and becomes simply energy in motion. The daily practice is to notice when your ego tries to don the guise of a savior in your relationships, and, consciously, take a step back. It's about biting your tongue when you feel the uncontrollable urge to give unsolicited advice, just to alleviate your own distress in the face of someone else's problem. It's about learning to endure the awkward silence and allowing the people you love the dignity to stumble, fall, and discover their own strength to get back up. By doing this, you will begin to notice that the chronic burnout you have carried for years, that invisible fatigue of someone who spends their life trying to be better, more productive, and more enlightened, will begin to melt like ice under the sun. I know how tired you are. I know the unbearable weight of carrying the obligation to constantly heal yourself, to monitor your own thoughts, as if you were a prisoner of your own mind, and to feel that you are never, under any circumstances, enough for life. But the final revelation that profound wisdom offers you today is a sacred permission to rest. You are allowed to lay down your weapons. You are allowed to stop fixing yourself, because the premise that you were essentially broken was the greatest of all illusions. Everything you have lived through, every tear swallowed, every sleepless night, every bitter failure, and every forgotten victory were the exact, precise, and irreplaceable ingredients that the great cauldron of your existence needed to forge the consciousness that now reads these words. Nothing was wasted. The lead of your deepest pain has already transformed into the gold of your presence. Even if your eyes, still addicted to finding flaws, take a while to recognize this quiet glow. From this day forward, your only true work is not to seek a glorious destiny, but to inhabit the sacred seat of witness. When you wash the dishes, simply wash the dishes. When you walk under the trees, feel gravity pulling your feet back to the earth, and know that you are supported and sustained by an infinite force that does not require your constant effort to keep the universe spinning. Life is a vast and impenetrable mystery that unfolds on its own, and you have the inalienable right to simply flow with it, without the exhausting need to understand or control it. The shocking beauty of reality is that the miracle you have spent your entire life searching for in the stars has been, all this time, silently beating within your own chest. You are already the final destination. If this silence resonated within you, and if these words touched that ancient and wise place in your soul that already knew all of this even before hearing it, don't let this energy dissipate into thin air without leaving a trace. Physical action anchors inner transformation in the material world. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue walking together through these forgotten landscapes of consciousness. Leave a like so this beacon reaches other travelers who are still exhausted, fighting against their own shadows on dark and lonely nights. And above all, go down to the comments and leave your mark. It doesn't have to be a grand declaration. You can write anonymously if you prefer to maintain your mystery, leaving only a word, a symbol, or a brief account of which of these burdens you finally decided to let go of today. By writing, you are not just talking to me or the algorithm. You are signing a peace treaty with yourself, witnessing before the world and your own psyche that your inner war is over. The door is open, the weight has been lifted, and now, for the first time, true life can finally begin.